Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. We will begin our conference now, and I would like to ask Professor Jan Rydel to officially open it.
Thank you. Good morning, good evening. It is my great pleasure to open the 10th conference of our annual series, this time titled Genealogies of Memory, the Holocaust between Global and Local Perspectives. After exploring diverse fields of history and memory in the Central and Eastern Europe and beyond, we have decided to undertake the important topic of Holocaust research and memory. It is the goal of the European network Remembrance and Solidarity to initiate dialogue and open discussion around sensitive topics of the 20th century European history. And it is especially the goal of the project Genealogies of Memory to support high-level scholarship and sophisticated academic discussion on that. The focus of the conference will be today's state of reflection and memory of the Holocaust, as formed both by national and transnational points of reference. These two dimensions are inevitable today in the globalized world when the Holocaust still should remain the warning symbol. We are very grateful to the partners who agreed to join us in the efforts of organizing this event. These are the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin and the Institute of Sociology of the Warsaw University. We also want to express our deep appreciation to institutions who accepted our invitation to discussion and who contributed so much to the conceptualizing of this conference. These are the Faculty of Polish Studies of the Jagiellonian University in Cracow, the German Historical Institute in Warsaw, the Ghetto Fighters House Museum in Israel, the Holocaust Memorial Center in Budapest, the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, the Shoah Memorial in Paris, the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies, and the Warsaw Ghetto Museum. I would also like to name all members of the academic committee of the conference. Małgorzata Głowacka-Grajper, Lior Inbar, Adam Kerpel-Fronius, Audrey Kisielewski, Tomasz Kowacz, Bela Raśki, Roma Sendyka, Hanna Węgrzynek, and Zofia Wójcicka. Thank you so much for all your constructive cooperation. This conference would definitely not be possible if not for your fruitful input. Thank you very much. And now I will pass microphone to the two conveners, Małgorzata Pakier and Małgorzata Wosińska, and wish you all good and fruitful conference. Thank you.
Thank you. I would also like to join Professor Rydel in the thanking to our partners, and we are really proud that such as institutions agreed to join us in this academic discussion. And before I begin, I would also like to thank Gabor Dani, the coordinator of all organization of this conference. Thanks very much, Gabor, and also to Antoni Zakrzewski, who has helped us as well. This event takes place within our annual conference cycle, Genealogies of Memory in Central and Eastern Europe. The program's common feature has been that, first of all, We have tried to look at memories and commemorated pasts, situating them in a long historical context. And secondly, that the regional and local Central and East European specificities have been always discussed in broader comparative and global perspective. In the course of the program, we have begun to conceptualize the notion of regions of memory. It will be presented broadly in a forthcoming book edited by Simon Lewis, Jeffrey Olick, Joanna Wawrzyniak, and myself. The regions of memory describe the spatial scale of memory of social memory that is above the national level, yet it is narrower than the global. But the notion also problematizes the very relation between the local or national social representations of the pasts and the ones that can be defined as unbound global. This relation, the dichotomy present in memory studies, is just as much relevant for the Holocaust memory studies and also for our conference starting today. The funding notions of the third wave of memory studies, as named by Astrid Earle, like transnational memory, global, globital, traveling, unbound, multidirectional memories, have been to a large extent developed based on processes of universalization of the Holocaust memory, as diagnosed and described especially by Daniel Levy, one of our keynotes at this conference, and Nathan Schneider. The attempts at searching for transnational and universal frames have often been formulated to counterweigh what could be called methodological nationalism in Holocaust research and memory studies. The category of nation has been paradoxically elevated by the self-critical coming to terms with the dark pasts. Scholars studying historiographies, education, cultural representations, and public debates have brought up the issue of memories of complicity and collaboration silenced within national historical narratives. The process of uncovering these dark historical chapters has been described by scholars with terms such as reversal in remembrance or negative memory. And that were national memories that were the dominating framework for their considerations. While the national was viewed in critical terms, transnationalization of memory has often been assumed, and also implicitly in scholarly discourse, as the desired social response. Without trying to undermine this important intellectual dynamics, recently more and more often we think that a third way, a synthesis, is needed. An approach that is both engaged with the critical testing of the national boundaries of Holocaust memory, but at the same time does apply a thick description of the local. The historical, situational, endemic, spatial, social, and cultural contexts of the past, and the important framework both for the post-war history of the post-war history of the Holocaust memory, as well as for the present phenomena of silence and commemoration. The aim of this conference is to assess the current state of the Holocaust memory research in the context of the interplay between the universal, global, transnational scale of Holocaust memory and that anchored in the endemic space and culture of historical experience, local, ethnic, national, environmental. We want to discuss both the mutual inspiration between the local and the global, as well as the conceptual misuses of the mnemonic, both the mnemonic universalizations and micro-contextualization of memories.
Thank you, Małgorzata. Good morning, everybody. The topic of our conference, the Holocaust between global and local perspectives, refers not only to the two spatial scales of memory, global and local, but at the same time has its important ethical dimensions. The confrontation of the local with the global bears the fundamental question about how to combine the perspective of the naked empirical experience of the Holocaust with its local, often forgotten grammar that is grounded in the specific landscape of the Central and Eastern Europe, and it has been built on the physical experience of human pain. So how to combine the embodied grammar of human pain with global perspective, global acts and processes of representation and commemoration of the Holocaust. As an anthropologist of genocide, I want to underline that these two perspectives, local and global, but also empirical, anthropological, and the perspective of representation, are important because of them, via them, we can read the Holocaust not only as an historical event, but also as a kind of anthropological experience. And this understanding via anthropological experience is vital, especially if we consider the still insensate need for the protection of human rights in the 21st century. Holocaust is not only a closed archive. It should be open, we should be aware and present with our intellectual and moral implications. The simultaneousness of the past and the present is beautifully reflected upon in the poem Certainty by Ewa Lipska, the Polish poet born in 1945, unfortunately rarely translated to other languages. So let me quote fragments of it in a free translation. Certainty. There already was such a history exam, which everyone failed. Only a cemetery is left of them. There already were people like us, though it's not certain they were us. There already was such a language, though it's not certain we spoke it. There already was such silence, though it's not certain it was among us. There already was the end of the world, though it's not certain it was our word. I strongly do believe that you are here because we want to listen the voices, we want to listen the voices of vulnerable groups, and we want to be aware and active, and we want to be today active listeners and witness, even though certainty or uncertainty sometimes is difficult to handle. Now let me move shortly discuss the structure of the conference. So the conference will be divided into 8 sessions, taking place every Wednesday and Thursday, with one exception. Next week we have Tuesday and Thursday, Tuesday instead of Wednesday. And it's going to be organized through the whole November. In the first session, the session we have today, titled Practical Ethics of Holocaust Memory in the 21st Century, the subject will be raised of responsibility of memory of the Holocaust and its moral ethical consequences in relation to the present day. The introductory lecture, Remembrance in and for the 21st Century, will be given by Piotr Cywiński. Thank you very much, Piotr, the director of Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Museum. It's a great honor to have you with us today. In the second session, the first session we are touching very fundamental global perspective question, and the second session it will be even more rooted in the ethical perspective, because in the second session, titled The Ringable Archive as the Area's Historiography of the Holocaust and its Impact on International Research, the session will be led by Paweł Śpiewak, director of the Jewish Historical Institute, and the keynote lecture will be held by Omer Bartow. We are very grateful for this lecture. We are going to figure out how important for the overall understanding of the process of shaping the roots of Holocaust studies per se, how important is to turn to the voices of its victims and their grammar of notation, of borderline experience, this experience of human pain, as I was talking before, on both semantic and symbolic layers. Then we are going deeper in the local context. The third session is titled Borderland Memories in Europe, Renegotiating Holocaust Remembrance. Here the keynote speaker will be Ewa Kovacs, the Vice Director of Wiesenthal Vienna Institute, who together with the panelists will show the tension arising when the reworked traumatic experience becomes not only an assignment for individual or common memory, but also the geopolitical national task, especially in the borderland spaces like in Central Eastern Europe and Western Europe, of course, as well. Going deeper in the local context, the fourth session will make it possible to go deeper into the domain of borderland experience, but we will going to be focused on language. The title is Overlooking the Local Dimensions of the Holocaust Language and the Cultural Spatial Politics of Transmission. The introductory lecture, Local Addresses in Holocaust Diaries, Reconstructing the Life Works of Young Jewish Diarists in Vilnius, will be held here by Mindaugas Kwietkauskas, the Minister of Culture of the Republic of Lithuania. Thank you very much. And also I would like to say thank you to Roma Syndyka. She is a member of our academic board, because this session was organized thanks to Roma Syndyka, and it's a special session under label of Jagiellonian University. Fifth session, we are going probably to the deeper layer of the local perspective, because we are going to understand how environment perspective could be held today, and we are going even deeper. We are going to look for forensic perspective in Holocaust studies. Beginning with the lecture of Ewa Domańska titled The Environmental History of the Holocaust, Chances and Challenges, we will pose a question on the universal meaning of research into physical landscape of the Holocaust. Sixth session. We are starting traveling back to what is global, what is transnational. So we will move forward questions of the ways of memory transformation, such as travel, translation, and very important, digitalization, in the context of Europe and Israel. The session is titled Translation and Travel of Holocaust Memory Between Europe and Israel. It will begin with the keynote by Jackie Feldman from Ben Gurion University. Thank you very much, Professor. His speech is titled On the Transformation of Memories of the Witness in the Digital Era. We are going back to what is global. So the seventh session, titled Holocaust Memory, Diagnosing the Global Effect. We will return, so the circle is somehow somewhere closed, the global perspective, trying to diagnose the mechanism, chances, and challenges of the process of universalization of the Holocaust experience in the 21st century. The introductory lecture, Mnemonics and its disconnects between integration and contestation, will be given by Daniel Levy of Stony Brook University. Thank you very much, Professor. And we are going to finalize our conference by roundtable discussion, but we do believe that it not be only a summarization, but also we are going to open a new question. As I told you before, we believe that is an open archive, and the Holocaust studies is a kind of open archive. Małgorzata Pakier is going to chair the roundtable discussion, our last final event, and in the discussion, Dorota Głowacka, professor from University of King's College, Halifax, will take part, and also our great keynotes like Daniel Levy, Jackie Feldman, Ewa Kovac, and Ewa Domańska. Thank you very much that you can be here together. It's a great pleasure and honor. And I am giving the floor to Małgorzata Pakier, who is going to chair the rest of the session today. Thank you very much.
So let's begin our session today, the title of which is Practical Ethics of Holocaust Memory in the 21st century. And before we start with the keynote, some basic information about the conference. The session today, as all the other sessions that will follow, will consist of two parts. The first part is with the keynote and the following questions and answer session. You will have an opportunity to ask your question. I will soon explain in what way. And then we take 15 minutes break, and after the break we continue with the second part, which is the panel with 4 presentations and a commentary. Now, how to ask questions. So some instructions. Those of you who attend the conference at the Zoom, you may simply use the Q&A panel and write down your question. Those of you who watch the conference transmission on YouTube or Facebook, you may write your question and send to us via email. The address is genealogies@enrs.eu. We will monitor the questions, collect them, and I will be the one who will be reading them and introduce to the keynote speaker and to the panelists. So please try to introduce yourself, write down who you are and from where you are, and also to make it everything a bit more easier, try to write your question or comment as clearly as possible and not too long. And best way is also to mention, to indicate who is the addressee of your question or comment. Now, let's move to the keynote. It is my real pleasure and real honor to introduce the keynote speaker of today's session, Piotr Cywiński, who was born in Warsaw in 1972. He is a Doctor of Humanities, a medieval historian, and a graduate of Mark Bloch University in Strasbourg, the Catholic University of Lublin, and the Institute of History of the Polish Academy of Science. Dr. Cywiński has been the director of the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum in Oświęcim since 2006. A member of the International Auschwitz Council. He was its secretary from 2000 until 2006. Between 2005 and 2014, he was deputy chairman of the Council of the International Center for Education about Auschwitz and the Holocaust. And in 2017, he became chairman of the program board of the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. His most important publications include Epitaph, 5 volumes from the series titled Miejsce Prawdy, The Place of Truth, including Sny obozowe w pamięci ocalałych z Auschwitz, Camp Dreams in the Memory of Auschwitz Survivors, and Rampa obozowa w pamięci Żydów deportowanych do Auschwitz, The Camp Ramp in the Memory of Jews deported to Auschwitz. Dr. Cywiński is also a co-author of an extended interview with Professor Władysław Bartoszewski titled Mój Auschwitz, My Auschwitz. Dr. Cywiński, now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank, first of all, the organizers to allow me to open this incredible conference with some remarks, opening remarks. Those few remarks on the remembrance, I would like to divide them maybe in 3 parties. The first will be how we arrived there, where we are until today. So the last 70 years, I will of course focus on the remembrance of the Shoah and the camps, less some others, genocides like Cambodia, Armenians, Gulags, Holodomor, or Rwanda, even if some of those development of the situation can be similarly analyzed in different other genocides. So how today, let's say, is present the remembrance, what are the functions, the tasks, the role, and I will finish, if you permit it, I will allow myself to propose some personal recommendations for the next future on this crucial topic for all of us. So, starting with the first part, yes, after the war, let's say the remembrance was not starting naturally, because everybody remembered very well what's happened. Trials, reconstructions, or very quickly some bipolar politics were certainly more important. And in fact, the first commemorations at some dates, at some places, at some occasions, were the first, in many countries, first, let's say, concrete way of express the remembrance. But in many countries, the first commemorations were more related to military victims, to soldiers, to some underground movement, some political prisoners or victims. And it was slowly, very slowly, some differences between those victims of the war and the civil victims, especially of the victims of the Shoah, appears in many countries. It took decades in some cases. In some countries it was more quick, in some others it took a longer time. In Israel, for example, of course, at the beginning, in a Zionistic perspective, in a construction of the country, this was perhaps not at the beginning the first subject of of political dialogue or political narrative. But in the 60s, with the Eichmann trial, of course, some topics appears very, very quickly on the public level. In France, for example, there was a competition, let's say, during many decades between this military, let's say, approach of the remembrance and the approach of the victims of the Shoah. And let's say this topic appears really in the public discussions after the film of Lanzmann, Shoah, in the 80s. I remember when I was studying in France the history before my baccalaureate in the very late 80s, it was not very present in the books of history at that time. In the 90s, the entrance of this topic in the curricula of the education appears in the Western countries, in 2000, early 2000 in the Eastern, Central and Eastern Europe. But in the East Bloc, the evolution was completely different because of the communist ideology. During the Stalinism time, all the Nazi barbarity was presented as an extreme, let's say, expression of the Western capitalistic imperialism. Only after the death of Stalin in the late 50s and 60s, a kind of normalization appears. It was the time when, for example, some memorials were organized in Belzec, in Treblinka, in Kulmhov, 33, 34, in 63, 64, in 65 in Sobibor. At that same time, in 67, was opened the Jewish first exhibition at Auschwitz, and the monument in Birkenau was erected. So this was the history of the 60s, and after 67, the Six-Day War, and the 68, it was relatively the end of this story in this part of Europe. Due to the raising of a real wave of the communist anti-Semitism, for example, there was some temptation from the party to remove the talits that open the main exhibition at the Memorial of Auschwitz. It never happened, but it was a very strong anti-Semitic policy from the communistic state. And only in the 80s, let's say, normalizations appears in those issues. But in the 90s, after the end of the communism, the problem was that different carriers of the remembrance appears at the same place of Auschwitz. This remembrance of the western part of Europe that was carried by, at that time already, by the remembrance of the Jewish victims, more than the, I don't know, military victims or underground movements. And in Poland, when the remembrance since the late 60s were carried basically by the political prisoners, the Polish non-Jewish victims. It was quite difficult in the 90s to let's say, make those two remembrances, those two memories, understand themselves together and understand that they are belonging to the same place and to the same time. After the war, some memorials, Gedenkstätte, lieux de mémoire, were built in different places. In 47, it was official opening of Auschwitz Memorial of Majdanek. After some memorials in the Germanic space, in Buchenwald, in Ravensbrück, and the late 50s and early 60s, Sachsenhausen. Some of those memorials were waiting a longer time. Mauthausen in the first half of the 60s. Due to international pressure of survivors, it's important to remember that. But for example, Gross-Rosen was waiting until 83 to be organized as a memorial. But the same evolution was reflected in some other countries outside even of the geography of the Shoah, understood by the geography of the dead places. Yad Vashem was created relatively early after the creation of the State of Israel in 53. But in the United States, Holocaust Memorial Museum only in 93. So it reflects already this change, this evolution of perspective of the remembrance. It is not only, let's say, a state decision to organize something like this. It's a result of a pressure of some public opinion. The Memorial de Shoah in Paris, as we know it together, was opened in 2005. The construction of this remembrance was very different between many different countries. If you remark, in Germany, those memorials were the focus point of the real, let's say, remembrance, with the commemoration, with the visits. In Germany, those memorials was belonging to some, are belonging now to some foundations created by lands, so not at the federal level, but at the local, regional level. In France, it was the Ministry of Veterans, today part of National Defense Ministry. In Italy, the remains of some camps or some infrastructure of dead are more dependent of the local communities, very local. In Austria, it was the Ministry of Interior. In Poland, from the beginning, it was the Ministry of Culture. Remark that in all those countries, we don't feel the presence at the beginning, but it is organized of the Ministry of Education. It's something that I think very, very important for the understanding of this issue. Different other structures are established, but not the Ministry of Education, because the remembrance at the beginning was not necessarily linked to the education. Yeah, the main functions of those memorials knew also an evolution during those decades, and it is also, I think, very, very important to understood. In the late 40s, just after the war, it was more considered like big cemeteries. In the 50s and the 60s, it was more developed as monuments. That is a normal evolution between a grave and a monument. In some of those places, museums, the museological role take a more important development in 70s, 80s, 90s, and the educational space start in the late 90s and in the 21st century, really. Even if before they've got some educational role with some visit of schools, the development of those programs were possible only when this history entered in the curriculum of the lessons of history. That's why I think it's very important to understand that those memorials, who were the focus points of this remembrance, were never linked to the Ministry of Education at the beginning. And they're still not really. Yes. Today, what is the situation? And I go to my second part. Until the COVID-19 arrived, in the most important places, we knew some growing number of attendance or frequency. Even if many voices at the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century told us that yes, now it will be the end of this remembrance of those visits, of the significance of those places, because we are changing of century, we are changing of generations, because I don't know, the Europe is reunificated, everything will be different. You have to think in terms of a little bit the end of a remembrance focused on the memorials. But nothing like this happened, and in all the places, the most important that I know, it was a growing of the frequency in the last, let's say, 10 or 15 years, with two, I think, very important elements. A very impressive presence of schools. It can be 60 until even 80%. It depends of the side that you are speaking about. And with a really growing presence of teachers who in the 21st century understood very well why they would like to bring the kids to those memorials. In the 90s, when the first groups were moving through Europe in order to show those places to young people, the teachers were traveling with them for the first time in their life. So they discovered at the same time that they show it to the kids. So it was really a difficult, let's say, perspective for an education when you have to prepare your class or your group to such difficult visit. Now it's different. The teachers of today basically were coming as students or kids in the 20th century, in the 90s. And the second very important element that we observe in the 21st century, it is a globalization of the significance of those sites. A lot of visits started from outside the area of the, let's say, historical implication of the society. For example, even from Europe. Last years in Auschwitz, one of the most important group of visitors, maybe the 5 first groups, depending on the country of origin, were Spanish people who got a very difficult history in the 20th century, but a completely different history. But they are coming certainly maybe 3 times more numerous than people from Germany to Auschwitz in the last 2, 3, 4 years. So this globalization started inside Europe, but very clearly it was going far. People from Asia, from some other part of the entire world started to visit those sites, trying to also compare, understood the big dilemma of their own remembrance. And this is something very important if we are speaking at the symbolical level, at the anthropological level of this remembrance. Also, the methodology of the presentation of the history of genocides, of the history of victims, of the history of hate, was also globalized. It is very difficult not to remark how such places like Auschwitz or others got influence on the organization of some memorials in Cambodia, in Armenia, Yerevan, in Perm 36 in Russia, some influences in Rwanda, basically in Kigali or in Urambi. Let's say it happened in the last decade in a very crucial and important promotion for the future of the concept of authenticity, that is to preserve what is authentic, because we have, I think, proven during those decades and generations that the authenticity is speaking very loudly to the imagination and to the intellect also of the people who are going through those spaces. But now we are in a time of incredible acceleration of changes. not cultural changes, but of the changes of the entire civilization in terms of many different levels of our human experience. The changes are touching the communication, certainly, the spirituality, the relations between the personal perspective and the society, the union between individuals and their traditional territories, technologies, the climate. We can make a list certainly longer. And the schools are completely unable to answer to those changes. Even today, we do, I don't know how many hundreds of hours on schools on the topic of mathematical functions that 95% of us never used after the baccalaureate. But we are unable to prepare the young people to those incredible changes, and this is something that is very, very important. I think it's one of the most common problem in many of our different school programs in many of our different countries. The media also are unable to have a vision for the future. It created incertitude, stress, fear, and it's a very, very good background, a very good field for the raising of the populism, of the demagogy, of the propaganda, of the xenophobia, and all those issues that we are all feeling. You can just see on the last news from Europe or from other parts of the world, that there is something that is stressful for our world. And if we are speaking about the remembrance, we have to consider that the past was supposed to protect us for the future. That's very clear. The never again was a clear appeal, a clear messages. It not started after the war. It started already during the camp. We have testimonies for that. And how are we acting today with this remembrance? We are more and more falling in a complete indifference, in a complete incapacity to imagine our role, our tastes, our responsibilities, our our responsibilities. In Rwanda, 25 years ago, it was still many voices who said in Europe or in the Western world that we do not act enough. But for the Rohingya in Myanmar, some 3 years ago, I do not hear really those voices. I don't hear them for the Uyghurs in China, and even now, yes, we are under pandemic, so maybe this will be the new excuse for us. But population in Yemen who is suffering of starvation, of hunger, maybe the biggest in their history, completely do not interest anybody, but anybody. It's not only a remark toward our society or ourselves, but even for our institutions. When the Rohingya were massacred in Myanmar in October 2017, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a motion when it's a quotation, they're expressing a grave concern at the recent reports of serious human rights violation and abuses in Myanmar. And this is the most brutal sentence of all these documents. So really, even at the level of the United Nations, that were created just after the war in order to protect the world of genocide like this, there was any capacity even to name the facts by their real concrete names. And the second remark that must be said, that together in different countries, we observe a really growing tendency for exploitation of the history and remembrance by politicians. This is something that is very clear in the last, let's say, decade or two. 90% of times when I read on newspapers or in internet some public voices on recent history, it's coming from politicians and not from historians. It's something very, very strange, first of all, because they do not speak about biology, astronomy, or philosophy. No, they are really focused on the history. And they are politicians and not historians, so their focus, their goal is a short-term political and local goal, and certainly not a worldwide, certainly not ethical goal for the remembrance. It creates problems also for us historians. We are in a way victims of the situations, like some prisoners. We are like in a trap, because if a historian, even on some research basis, publish some theses that are not following the main ideas presented by politicians to the great public, they are very quickly accused of rejecting, attacking, adopting, or I don't know, entering in discussion with the political perspective, even if they are working only in a historical approach. So we are now in a very difficult situation. We have people who are coming to those memorials, before the COVID now, and now it's as hopefully short period, very difficult. But they are moved. They are crying sometimes. They are trying to think on. They are buying books. Yes, after they go back to their home, to their families, to their schools, to their local reality, and they're still moved, sincerely moved. I have no doubt when they think about this visit that they did, but they do not feel that from this learning, from this remembrance, from this memory, there is something that can be expressed in terms of their own responsibility in their own life. There are two ways for the future. We can look on the past and only judge it, say, it was terrible, it was incomprehensible, it was a tragedy. Okay. But we can also take a second way, so understand that the past is a part of our present, of our identity, and in this situation of our today responsibility. And the remembrance, I do not think, are really going in these directions now in the world. In the 90s, the Shoah as a separate thema of the history entered in the curricula in the schools, but only, or nearly only, in the programs of history. It was totally understandable at that time. The biggest danger in the early 90s were the deniers in Europe, in Lyon, in Great Britain, in some other countries. The negationists. It was certainly the most important task at that time was to really put the Holocaust as a concrete part of the 20th century, as a fact that you cannot deny. But as all the historians know, history is not really a magister vitae. It's something that is far, more and more far. It's not the time of our grandfather for the kids of today, it's the time of the grandfather. On pictures, it's black and white. It seems not really understandable, but it's a common experience for our generations. So we have to change something in our way to express our remembrance and in our way to teach how to remember. Our schools must adopt the message of the past as a projection, let's say, for our future. The link between the past and the future is certainly not enough present today in our school programs in the whole Europe and I think Western world. I will not speak for some other continents. I am not specialist on those topics, but in Europe I see that very, very clearly. Where is the place of the Shoah in the lessons on ethics, religion, social sciences, politology, the civic education in the schools, or some lessons on mass media? Those are lessons that are directly linked with the today world, with the today populism, with the today propaganda, with the today risk of extension of some xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and other form of racism in our countries. So our memorials must become not only place of sorrow, place of people who are moved and who cry, but also places where people are, let's say, going out after a visit with a fundamental doubt on their self, a sort of moral anxiety of their own responsibility for today. This is something that is absolutely needed if you want to connect the remembrance with the responsibility for the future. People have to question themselves on their role at the level they are living, at their perspective, at the perspective that they feel belonging to, at the everyday life, let's say. And I'm really sure that it needs some changes in the curricula in schools. It really needs some changes at the narratives of the memorial in the whole Europe and outside. And I'm persuaded that it needs also on the way how we allow as societies our politicians to use the memory and the remembrance and the history. And those are changes that we have to operate urgently if you want to come back, to diminish, let's say, our indifference, our incapacity to imagine our role, our future, and the way to build it even at our human local level. So I think this ethical challenge is really the most important challenge for the remembrance, for a future praxeology of the remembrance for all of us. And I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cywiński. It was extremely interesting, and I have already gathered some questions to you. We are also awaiting questions from the conference participants and audiences on YouTube and Facebook, so please send them if you would like them to be asked. So if there is time now, I will use the opportunity. Well, first of all, just to refer to your one of your last reflection, could you develop a bit on in what way would you see politicians using the symbol and engaging in the symbol of Auschwitz? Actually, we have witnessed rather misuses of the symbol, especially during the official commemorations at the beginning of this year, before the COVID, in a different epoch still. Could you develop a bit on that and tell us what would be the proper ways of political uses of this past? Another question that I will just drop now too, so that you have maybe reflect on that and develop whether you'll upon your wish. Jay Winter has defined, it will be about definition or how you understand the notion of memory. The historian and memory scholar Jay Winter defined memory as, I will speak in my own words, as a need to speak out, to articulate someone's own or biographical experience, biographical or historical, depending whether we speak about individual or collective national memories, group memories. So I would be, while everything you are telling us, and we know that because you work especially as practitioner of memory, is more about lessons from the past, lessons from history. So I am very interested in hearing your own working definition of memory, of the functions of memory and the purpose of memory.
Thank you very much. The politicians, how I see their way to operate in the Auschwitz area. I was not speaking only about Auschwitz, unfortunately. I was speaking in general about the history and about the remembrance, about the past. It's something certainly larger. There are different approaches. Not all must be condemned, of course, but I will prefer than the historical research will be reserved for historians. The historical learning will be reserved for specialists of education and not necessary for politicians. In Auschwitz, we see some very good approaches that I remember, and some very, very controversial. I remember a candidate for a post of Prime Minister or of President, I don't remember, it's not important, a few years ago, was coming to pay a visit. It's okay, but he was coming, I don't know, 3 weeks before the elections with 10 TV cameras with him. Yeah, this is a violation of the real remembrance of the victim. He was not coming for the remembrance, he was coming for himself. It was a political aggression to the memory, to explore like this, let's say, the pain of the victims in his campaign. So this is the reality everywhere. The memorials are many times dependent of financially or some other way from some political decisions. I think there must be a real need of, let's say, a holy distance between what is politic. This means a short term, even not strategy, more tactic, and what is remembrance that was built on the pain of concrete victims. It's something that cannot be really used, and it appears more and more in our today's world, in Europe and outside of Europe, of course. This is the first issue. The second issue, definitions. You will be certainly disappointed of my.
Just to draw to go deeper into this first subject. So, could you give some examples of such positive political uses with the holy distance, as you named it? Are there some examples that
Yes,
come to your mind?
of course, I've got some visits that was nearly without media when we are walking the both, speaking for a long time about many different issues. A visit where that was, for example, prepared for 2 hours or 2 hours and a half, and it took nearly 5 hours without any registration through media, through radios, through TVs. Yeah, with some concrete reaction that I saw in the politics after this visit, in the way that this politician developed his own approach. I don't want to give here names because I'm not in the role of judge, but if I see, let's say, a group of politicians who are coming from a parliament with a few official photographers to take pictures of their visit, of course not of the memorial, but of their visit in the memorial. And when during the discussion with those politicians, I hear, "Oh, dear director, what would you do with this painful problem of the selfies in Auschwitz?" This is a little bit to compare what is maturity and what is a perspective immature. But of course, there are many different examples that I could give, but I don't want to give them publicly because it would be necessary to quote some names. Really, it's not my role. But if you look on the political narratives in many countries, the history, the Holocaust, the Auschwitz, some other genocides are many times used as rhetoric, let's say, arguments in the discussions, a sort of a new way of reductio ad Hitlerum, without really understanding that it is playing with the victims and with the very human pain. I've got already some politicians that really would like to have their statement to the media said under the gate "Arbeit macht frei" in Auschwitz. And sometimes at the really last moment, I've got to tell them that if they continue to make a pressure like this, I will close the museum this day for everybody, because it's something that is completely impossible. If I can go to the question of the definition of the memory, as I started to say, you will be disappointed. There are so many definitions coming from so many different parts of the world, cultural approach, religious approach, societies, individual philosophical, let's say, perception, that in my practical, let's say, life, if my practical dialogue with all those imaginations of the memory and of the remembrance, I do not exclude, let's say, any non-offensive definition. In general, I don't like definitions. I have an approach certainly more phenomenological than I don't know, in the line of the Thomist philosophy that would like to give a definition for all what we can perceive. For me, the definition is also a sort of exclusion. And we are working with people, with very concrete people, and we don't ask to those people what is their definition of the memory, what is their definition of the awareness, what is their definition of the responsibility. So if now I will give you a definition, it will be a sort of exclusion for all the others' understanding of the remembrance. I prefer to stay on my phenomenological approach.
Thank you. We have one question from the audience. I will read it. It is by Bartosz Dziewanowski-Stefańczyk. Regarding the using of memory by politicians, as I suppose this is the ultimate proof that memory is still important for their societies. So does it mean that politicians will stop using memory once it will no longer be important for their voters?
Not sure if it's a complete, let's say, approach that we can have on those phenomena. Yes, I don't know if the memory is important or if the past is important for them. This is also a question of definition, perhaps, but I will stay on my approach without definitions. I think that the politicians need more some symbols. It's not really a remembrance. It's not really a historical approach. But I have the impression that one generation before, in general in Europe, I'm not speaking in particular in Poland or in some other country, in general, there was still an understanding that there are some holy spaces, there are some thema that you cannot use, that there are some symbol that you cannot play with, and it's now evolving very, very quickly because of the generations, because of the, I don't know, the evolution of the politics also, that is falling in a more demagogical and more propagandistic style, certainly. But I think we can imagine an evolution of the remembrance, of the culture of remembrance, that will not consider that everything is possible, that will consider that not everything is good and not everything can bring you some voters. Not everything is funny, not everything is cool, not everything is easy to say, not everything needs to be said. I can really imagine a sort of remembrance in that perspective. I do not think that the memory is depending on politicians, certainly not.
Thank you. I also have a question whether is there some special program at the Auschwitz Museum of researching the audiences? Do you have some experience in that, and if you could tell a bit?
Now today, researching audiences is a big task. We've got 100 or 200 visitors last days per day. So it's a very difficult time. Before the COVID, we've got maybe even too much visitors. So it's a different issue. It was sometimes difficult to organize, let's say, from a practical point of view, those frequency. Now we are developing more on some educational perspectives. We have opened just before at the end of the last year, a very good center for the education, 6 or 7 classrooms, and amphitheater, a very good aula, with many possibilities of working with people inside. But just after it was the holidays of the end of the year, it was anniversary of the liberation, and the COVID arrived. So we have a wonderful center of education that we are not able to use really now. So we are trying to develop some new tools through the internet, through some applications, through some possibilities. It will take sometimes, certainly, because we are not ready before the pandemic to really propose some new tools that we are in need now. We've got already some, I don't know, virtual panorama or some lessons in many languages, but we know that we need some more presence. And we try also really to be active in the social media. It's something I think very important. We can of course say that the social media changed our perspective of the dialogue, of the communication. That it's terrible because the history of the Holocaust is so difficult to be transmitted in this social media. You know, you cannot criticize the internet. You have to work with, and you have maybe to rethink your way to communicate with the entire world. And this is something that we try to do. I don't know what will be after the pandemic, if there will be so many people who would like, and how quickly they would like to come back to revisit the authenticity of the place. So certainly we have to prepare some other way to reach our expected audience, and mainly to be really present in the not only present, let's say, to try to lead some discussions around our topics in the world. But it's very difficult. You have to be prophetic in a sense today, because nobody knows what will be in 2 years.
Thank you very much. The topic of this digital media and how it can be used, it will be continued also in the context of visits to Auschwitz during our sixth session on the translation and travel of Holocaust memory. So thank you very much for this extremely interesting, insightful keynote connecting the history of the Holocaust with the contemporarity of the past. So how the past is present in the present is extremely important here. We will have now a 15 minutes break, and we will resume at 4:30. Once again, thank you very much, and see you soon. So hello, we are here again and we will resume the first session with the second part, the panel presentations. We are in the session Practical Ethics of Holocaust Memory in the 21st Century, and our first panelist, our first speaker in this session will be Sławomir Kapralski with the text titled The Roma and the Holocaust, Memory Between Recognition and Redistribution. And Sławomir Kapralski is Professor of Sociology at the Pedagogical University of Cracow and a recurrent visiting lecturer at the Graduate School for Social Research, Center for Social Studies, operated by the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw. He graduated from the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, where he also received his PhD in sociology and started his academic career. Then, for many years, he was associated with the Central European University in Prague, Warsaw, and Budapest. Sławomir Kapralski's research focuses on nationalism, ethnicity and identity, collective memory, anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, as well as Roma communities in Europe. He is a member of the Gypsy Law Society and the editorial board of Romani Studies. Professor Kapralski, the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Małgorzata. It's a great pleasure to see you after a long period of no see. Okay, my paper is kind of a working paper in which I'm trying to combine two pairs of concepts. The one is about memory. I'm dividing memory into discursive memory and non-discursive or embedded memory. And the other pair of concepts is recognition and redistribution. Discursive memory is the memory that we formulate in speech or in writing, the memory that we communicate to others, the memory that we discuss, the memory that we are usually aware of having. The embedded memory, the non-discursive memory, is the silent memory, which is stored in those sectors of social life which are usually not directly associated with remembrance. So the memories of the armed conflicts can be stored in the demography of the community. We can see the losses of population in the demographic data. We can see sometimes the remnants of the past events in the social structure of a given community, and sometimes in composition of cultural peculiar to that group. On the other hand, recognition and redistribution are two important topics of contemporary activism. Recognition focuses on identity. It is mostly an activity to become recognized internationally as a group which has certain rights, as a distinct group which has a particular identity, while redistribution focuses on the material situation of living conditions of Roma community. So I want to frame the memory problem in the political or economic problem that characterize contemporary Roma communities. I've introduced the concept of embedded or non-discursive memory into my study on the Roma remembrance of the period of the Holocaust, because because Roma constitute a difficult case for memory studies. The genocide that Roma were the victims of was or had a specific nature, and they don't form a consistent community of memory or mnemonic community. Different groups of Roma were differently persecuted in different periods of time. This persecution was sometimes decentered, desynchronized, and therefore contemporary Roma are largely divided regarding their memories of the suffering during the Second World War. Even within one country, the particular Roma groups could have entirely different memories of that period. Therefore, we may say that it is not an automatic process that memory of the suffering during the Second World War would unite different Roma groups. Secondly, we may say that there is a lot of silence about the fate of Roma during the Second World War for various reasons. The survivors were often traumatized and simply didn't want to remember because remembrance caused psychological pain. Secondly, the non-Roma people were usually not particularly interested in listening to the testimony of the Roma survivors. Thirdly, unfortunately, the persecution of Roma didn't stop after the end of the Second World War. They were still discriminated against, and the perpetrators, those in Nazi Germany or in the collaborating countries who were responsible for the persecution, the Roma were practically never prosecuted. Therefore, the situation after the war was not safe for the Roma, not safe enough to raise the issue of memory. Simply speaking, Roma had to elaborate a certain way of living together with the majority that often persecuted them. And of course, reminding about Roma suffering wasn't the best way of arranging for such a situation. Therefore, because of the problems with the discursive memory, and one should add here one more thing, namely the fact that Roma as an underprivileged community didn't have means to control the process of memory transmission. Roma didn't have a political organizations, didn't have institutions which would control their memories. Therefore, most of the Roma remembrances about the Second World War and the suffering of Roma groups was preserved in the non-discursive or embedded way. And one of such ways of storing the memory of the Roma is the issue related to gender relations, the position of women in so-called traditional Roma communities testifies in my approach to the memory of the past. I should start with the fact that before the Second World War, we could observe a process of a spontaneous modernization of many Roma communities, especially in Germany, when we are talking about German Sinti as they prefer to call themselves instead of using the term Roma. We could see that the position of women in the Sinti communities was changing before the war into greater equality. This has changed entirely after the Second World War, where the women start to be again subordinated and fully subjected to full control by the male members of the community. In cultural terms, the women were associated with the tabooed spheres of pollution and generally perceived as threat and danger to the identity of Roma people, which was defined in male terminology as the ideology of the brotherhood of the male members of the community. This switch from the spontaneous modernization to tradition can be interpreted, according to some historians, most notably according to Kirsten Martins-Hoyes, as a reaction to the experience of the genocide. The persecution the Roma were suffering from during the Second World War seriously threatened the social boundary of this group. And therefore, the group create protective measures. The group somehow reproduced the boundary between the Roma and non-Roma within the Roma community, as the boundary between the male world and the female world. The lack of control of the external border was therefore compensated by the ability of the male members of the Roma groups to control the internal boundary. This is the trick that I actually borrowed from social theory. This is a thesis by Niklas Luhmann, a famous sociologist doing system theory, that the boundary between a system and environment is usually reproduced within the system as the boundary between subsystems. So the boundary between Roma and non-Roma is reproduced within the Roma communities as the boundary between the male and female worlds. The first boundary cannot be controlled by the Roma because Roma are underprivileged and powerless. The second boundary, the internal boundary, however, can be controlled. And such an increased control after the Second World War can be accounted for by the experience of Roma suffering during the war. In general, this process meant retraditionalization, and it confirms the work of many anthropologists like Jack Goody or Erickson or Apadurai, that as a matter of fact, when we are talking about the so-called traditional groups, we often are dealing with the groups that went through the process of retraditionalization. They became traditional because something happened, something that that set in motion the mechanisms of retraditionalization as a defense mechanism against the contemporary situation. And that was precisely the case of some groups of Roma, something that I could also see in my own empirical research among Roma from southern Poland and from Slovakia, which are very similar culturally, but they had different history during the Second World War, and this different history is actually quite well stored in various cultural specificities of these two groups. Now, what is the relation between this non-discursive embedded memory and the debate about the recognition versus redistribution in Roma communities? Well, usually memory is associated with recognition because memory builds identities, and recognition is about identity. The strategies, the activities that contribute towards recognition of the Roma are usually perceived as contradicting or harming the attempts to improve the Roma living conditions. Therefore, the attempts to redistribute, to have a better, let's say, social economic justice for the Roma. I think that this is not necessarily so. That that as a matter of fact, the process of identity building, but based on discursive memory, can very well contribute to the fight for a better redistribution of goods. And I think that this standpoint can be supported in general theory by the theory of Axel Honneth, theory of recognition, modified slightly in view of Nancy Fraser's criticism. The conscious attempts to reclaim the memory of Roma suffering could be used as a resource in the activism targeting the redistribution and improvement of Roma living conditions. And we could observe actually precisely such a synthesis, for example, in the history of the political movement of Roma in Germany and in Europe in general. The movement that often focused on history, often focused on the Roma suffering, but not to strengthen the sense of the divisions between various identities of Roma groups, but rather to treat the memory as the resource in the fight for a more just world in which Roma would live in a better way. So, thank you very much. I guess I've had 20 minutes and I'm in time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You are perfect in time. It was very interesting, and it's very good to see you too here. We will move now to the next presentation by Olof Bortz, the title of which is Raul Hilberg, a Holocaust scholar and agent of Holocaust memory. And Olof Bortz is a postdoctoral researcher at the EHESS in Paris and at the Department of History at Uppsala University. He completed his PhD dissertation in 2017 at Stockholm University on the work of Raul Hilberg, a study which he is turning into a book at the moment. Mr. Bortz's postdoctoral project deals with scholarly interpretations of Nazism before the Second World War in France, the United Kingdom, and the United States. He is also engaged in projects dealing with Swedish anti-Semitism, as well as the history of Swedish diplomacy and the Holocaust. Hello, Olof Bortz, the floor is yours now.
Hello, and first of all, I want to take the opportunity to thank the organizers for bringing together this wonderful conference, and Also, although I cannot see or hear anybody right now, I would like to thank everybody who is listening to me and us. So today I'm going to talk about Raul Hilberg and Holocaust memory. Raul Hilberg is mainly known as one of the foremost pioneers of Holocaust historiography. The Destruction of the European Jews, first published in 1961, is commonly regarded as a milestone in the development of Holocaust studies, and it played an important role in inspiring subsequent generations of Holocaust scholars. And this paper will deal with Hilberg's work in relation to Holocaust memory, and that might appear somewhat counterintuitive because Raul Hilberg is mainly known as a scholar interested in the minute details of what he called the machinery of destruction. He was, as he liked to point out himself, a footnote writer. And as an example, one could mention his appearance in Claude Lanzmann's 1985 documentary Shoah, which was already mentioned during the keynote lecture. And in that documentary, Hilberg can be seen explaining the details of a German railway timetable for trains carrying Jews to their deaths in 1942. However, apart from this image of an almost monastic scholar who spent his free time sifting through microfilms of German documents, there was a very strong link between Hilberg's research and his understanding of public interpretations of the Holocaust in post-war America. Furthermore, Hilberg took a very keen interest in and active part in the creation of Holocaust memory and Holocaust commemoration during the later phase of his career. And so in this paper, I will start by talking about the link between his actual research and the memory of the Holocaust, and then I will move on to his work for the planning of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. First of all, Hilberg was born in Vienna in 1926. He lived under Nazi rule for about 13 months before fleeing Nazi Germany with his parents in April 1939. They traveled to the United States via Cuba, settled in Brooklyn in the United States, where they were fortunate enough to have family who could vouch for them. He returned to Europe as an American soldier during the final phase of World War II, and when he came back to the US, he studied history and political science at Brooklyn College. It was there that he developed his interest in the phenomenon of bureaucracy in the classroom of Hans Rosenberg, who was an emigre scholar of German Jewish background and an expert on the history of Prussia and the Prussian bureaucracy. After graduating from Brooklyn College, Hilberg went on to Columbia University, where he studied political science, and it was there in the late 1940s and the first half of the 1950s that he wrote his master's thesis and his doctoral dissertation on the bureaucratic administration of the Jewish genocide. And both his master's thesis and doctoral dissertation was written under the supervision of Franz Neumann, who was another German Jewish emigre and who had written a structural analysis of Nazi Germany published during the war. And Hilberg argued in his research that the genocide of the Jews was a modern bureaucratic process, and he stressed also that all of German society, all of organized German society was active in this process, and also that the perpetrators were not sort of abnormal group of people, either in political or psychological terms. When Hilberg first decided to study the Holocaust in the late 1940s, he was convinced that he was the only one doing so. He experienced a form of reluctance surrounding this topic, and he explained this with regards to the Cold War and the fact that West Germany was now an ally of the West in the confrontation with the Soviet Union. During the 1950s, Hilberg made physical and mental notes of individuals who tried to discourage him from pursuing this topic, and these comments sort of strengthened his conviction that his work had to be undertaken. However, Hilberg's work was not only reaction to the fact that he saw that there was a sort of a lack of recognition of the significance of the Holocaust in general. It was also a reaction to the Jewish memory of the Holocaust. Hilberg was well aware of the role played by Holocaust memory within Jewish communities in North America, Europe, and Israel, and other countries. But for him, this was not enough. So in his view, this cultural commemoration with the dead and their communities, whereas he was interested in the perpetrators, their deed, and its meaning for race relations in modern society. So even though Hilberg wrote at length and in a controversial manner about Jewish reactions in his work, he stated in the preface of his opus that this was, quote, not a book about the Jews. And when his book was published in the early 1960s, it was remarkably well received. It gained a lot of attention, more than Hilberg had expected at the time, and much more than he conceded in his autobiography, which was published in 1996. According to Hilberg, he had expected that his conclusion regarding the involvement of the entire German society would be controversial. However, after almost a decade, that is the 1950s, of research and debate on totalitarianism, and also coming as it did in connection with the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem, one of the key administrators of the final solution, Hilberg's thesis on the importance of German state bureaucracy and the ordinary character of most perpetrators were hardly difficult to accept. Instead, Hilberg's work helped to cement this image of the so-called desk killer. But however, his understanding of the reactions of the Jewish victims was something that was controversial. Hilberg argued that the Jewish victims reacted to persecution in the way that the Jews of the diaspora had always done, that is, by appeasing their persecutors. This was not a new notion, but Hilberg presented it in the first American study of the Holocaust at a time when there was a sort of general need amongst observers, journalists, and intellectuals of a work of reference on this event. And Jewish historians, intellectuals, and refugees reacted to this thesis presented by Hilberg, and also by writers such as Hannah Arendt and Bruno Bettelheim. And there was an outpouring of articles and also books about Jewish resistance to the Nazis. So in this sense, one could say that the Jewish memory of the Holocaust was constructed in reaction to Hilberg's work. For a long time, or at least during the 1960s, Hilberg's impact on Holocaust memory was limited to his research and the occasional public appearance. This changed dramatically during the 1970s. In the early 1970s, Hilberg started teaching a course on the Holocaust at the University of Vermont, which attracted large numbers of students. At the same time, during the 1970s, there was a growing number of conferences on Holocaust history, which brought together scholars mainly from North America and the Holocaust, so became part of an international field of studies. So if Hilberg had started his academic career as an outsider, or at least to his own mind, that was what he was. This was clearly no longer the case. In more general political and cultural terms, this had to do with a series of events in American politics, domestic and foreign policies, ranging from police brutality, civil unrest, riots, and war crimes, and corruption at the highest echelons of power. So, for example, the in cities and neighborhoods with predominantly African American population, following on police brutality and killings of unarmed Americans, starting in 1964 and continuing till 1967. The Vietnam War and the My Lai massacre of Vietnamese villagers in 1968. The repression of the anti-war movement in the US, and also the Watergate scandal in 1972. So taken together, all these different events and problems created sort of a questioning of America's standing and America's identity, especially by the generation who grew up after World War II. And perhaps the most clear expression of the sort of newfound role of Holocaust memory was the airing of the NBC television miniseries Holocaust in 1978. In that same year, President Jimmy Carter created his President's Commission on the Holocaust, following some time of strained relations with the American Jewish community, which was a result of Carter's Middle Eastern policies. And Hilberg was elected member of this President's Commission. He was the only scholar, and he was also a member of the United States Holocaust Memorial Council, which followed upon the commission, and which had the task of establishing an American memorial to the Holocaust. Hilberg gave endless hours of his time for the planning of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and he tried to make sure that this would be an institution of research and education as opposed to only commemoration. However, he also took an interest in the more sort of strictly commemorative aspects of the museum, like what would this building look like and how would the history of the Holocaust be displayed there. And he wanted the building to reflect his own views of, or his own understanding of this event. So when an early guideline presented in 1979 included the specification that the monument be beautiful, Hilberg commented commented that we do not wish to frighten children, but somehow a memorial would, in my mind, distort history if it were not in some sense brutal. End of quote. And 2 years later, he argued that the building should be constructed using rough materials, which would evoke which would, quote, evoke the primitive elemental forces that generated the Holocaust. Hilberg's vision would prove to be very close to the design realized by the architect James Ingo Fried several years later with its used exposed brick and metal. After the building was finished in the early 1990s, Hilberg congratulated Fried for having constructed a concentration camp in Washington, D.C. The museum's former exhibition director, however, considered it a monument with problematic overtones, presumably for the same reasons which elicited Hilberg's praise. In Hilberg's work for the Content Committee, which had a task of creating the permanent exhibition at the museum, Hilberg opposed what he considered to be generic and worn-out symbolism. He had very strong views about Holocaust memorials which did not live up to his standards and which he regarded as kitsch. He was in favor of historical models of, for example, of the Warsaw Ghetto or Treblinka, but he opposed reproductions of historical artifacts. This was not simply a question of aesthetical preferences, but also a form of commitment to the historical event. As Hilberg put it, quote, "Once the symbol takes over, we may have difficulty convincing the visitor that the real object was ever in existence or that the real event had ever occurred." Incidentally, for Hilberg, this concern also applied to the writing of history. In his view, it is the words, the written history, which is remembered instead of the event itself. And Hilberg's background as a scholar, or his identity as a scholar, affected his opinion also regarding larger issues about how to present the history of the Holocaust at the museum. One such large question was whether this was primarily a Jewish event or whether it also included other groups of victims. And based on Hilberg's knowledge of the sources and for purposes of research, Hilberg favored a more inclusive understanding of the victims. As he pointed out, although the fate meted out to Jews and Roma was unique, the different victim categories were not separated in the sources. And although focusing on the Jewish victims or the Jewish fate, the museum decided to include Soviet prisoners of war, the Poles, the disabled, Roma, the homosexuals, and the Jehovah's Witnesses. Hilberg believed in the importance of making the exhibition as authentic as possible, both in terms of the artifacts displayed and in terms of how this history was presented, sort of the storytelling aspect of it. And there was an initial suggestion to lead the visitors through a reversed chronological order. And this, found the purpose was to end the visit on an upbeat note. So the visitor would start with the remnants of the victims and conclude with the life of pre-war Europe. So, and there were committee members favoring this because they thought this would attract rather than frighten potential visitors. But Hilberg and several other committee members rejected this proposal, which was subsequently dropped. And this was not the only example of how different points of views concerning the history were confronted during the planning of the USHMM. Okay, I will try to wrap up. For example, there was the museum received a shipment of human hair in the late 1980s from the Museum of Auschwitz-Birkenau. There was a debate about what to do with it, and Hilberg and others argued that this was important to display the hair because to underscore the industrial aspect, the dimension of the genocidal process. But there were survivors who argued that this could have been their hair or the hair of their family members. So it was decided in the end to show a picture of it. It was also gas canisters who had once been used for Cyclone B, and Hilberg argued that the museum should display one of these gas canisters mounted on a pedestal in its own room. And in the end, these canisters were thrown in a heap in the floor, where sort of the impact was diminished, as Edward T. Linenthal argued. But there is, however, a different can, a milk can, which is displayed in a way similar to what Hilberg suggested, but although not in its own room, and that is the can which once contained the Ringelblum archive from the Warsaw Ghetto. So yeah, just to wrap up this, I had to skip some of my presentation, but in the end, I think this example shows that there are different tensions between how to present the memory and history of the Holocaust, which are perhaps today not mutually exclusive, which were on display during these processes of how to commemorate the Holocaust. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. Now we have the third presentation in this panel by Kimberly reading about local journalists, distant genocides, and global bystanders. Hello, Kimberly. It's nice to see you. Kimberly Redding was born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She earned a PhD in modern European history from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, conducting research with support from the Berlin Program for Advanced German and European Studies and the DAAD. She joined the history faculty at Carroll University in Waukesha, Wisconsin in 2001 and was awarded a senior Fulbright Research Fellowship in 2009. Her scholarly and pedagogical initiatives reflect her interests in memory and oral history, the intersection of local and national narratives, and cross-cultural identity. Her essay titled Retouching Heimat, Expellees, Home and Belonging in German Schools Post-War Curricula is forthcoming in History of Education Oral History Review. She is a frequent reviewer of the Oral History Review. She has mentored student research for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's History Unfolded project since 2017, and she serves on the board of the Waukesha County Historical Society and Museum. Dr. Redding has 3 young adult sons. And the floor is yours now.
Thank you so much. I don't know if the PowerPoint will work, but we'll see if that happens. I don't see it. I don't know if you all see it or not, but oh, there it is. Great. Thank you. Thank you all so much for including me in the conference today. Of course, I had hoped to travel across the pond, but this is second best, and I'm so delighted to be here, and I so appreciate the technological support in the background. Very helpful. So yes, I'd like to talk this morning about the intersection of local journalists, distant genocides, i.e. the Holocaust, and global bystanders. So the contemporary focus on integrated histories of the Holocaust, which is what this conference is doing, rightly centers on Central Europe and the multifaceted roles played by local authorities and national institutions in European memory landscapes. Outside the European public sphere, however, I think this focus risks perpetuating what I call a complacent voyeurism in both collective memory and public commemoration. Evidence of this complacent voyeurism is demonstrated in official memory culture in the US, in public opinion research, and in school and university curricula. So with that in mind, I'd like to discuss 3 points today. First, I'd like to suggest to you that in the US, public narratives of the Holocaust, both in the 1940s and today, use a strategy called distantiated voyeurism, remembering or knowing from afar. This subsumes the Holocaust into American myths of the good war, and it shores up a national identity rooted in distance, ethical certitude, and exceptionalism. So that's my first point. Second point, the US Holocaust Memorial Museum is challenging this self-congratulatory memory culture through the History Unfolded project. And then third, I'll argue that if indeed a goal of genocide studies is prevention, and I think it is, we all must broaden our categories of bystander and perhaps fellow traveler to include ordinary men and women far outside the borders of Central and Eastern Europe. Oh, it worked, great. So this is to point one. In 2003, Peter Novick argued that the United States has no national narrative of the Holocaust. He didn't mean that American schools don't teach the Holocaust. They do. It's a beloved unit among students. And there are more than 50 genocide studies centers and degree programs in higher education. Regional memorials and museums also provide rich resources. The Illinois Holocaust Memorial Museum in suburban Chicago, for example, has created holographic survivor programs. And that's what you see there on it's my left, I hope it's your left as well. That's a hologram of a Holocaust survivor interacting with students. And I'll say more about that, I think, in a minute. At the national level, as Olof has sort of suggested, the US Holocaust Memorial Museum sets the tone. And it, like all of these other initiatives, focus on, in this order, preserving survivor memory, promoting rigorous scholarship, and drawing attention to genocide prevention. All of these initiatives, public and private, rest on particularly American constructions of collective memory and cultural space. And for this, I think Robert St. Clair's sedimentation theory of cultural space helps explain this. St. Clair suggests that patterns of cultural memory accumulate over time. They sink into one another, they weigh down one another, and they even interact. And these layers of memory are not passive archives. Rather, the weight and substance of these different layers structure how cultures remember and relearn to remember over time. St. Clair argues that these layers of memory teach and reteach. They tell us how to remember. And sedimentation theory helps explain how Americans have learned to remember the Holocaust. American memory culture had already disappeared the near extermination of more than 700 distinct cultural groups, Native American Indians, reducing public narratives and memories of that to an occasional war monument and to Wild West shows. By the 1940s, particularly north of the Mason-Dixon line, American memory culture had learned to erase the slave trade, the Ku Klux Klan, etc., from collective memories of the Grand Old South. As a result, in the 1940s, in the face of rising anti-Semitism and the threat of genocide in Europe, Americans were primed to, and this is a quote, trace the same contours with different pens. I'm quoting activist Kwame Anthony Appiah there. What's missing from sedimentation theory, it seems to me, are the myths, the pedagogical stories that slice through these layers of memory. In American culture, distance is the granite core of many of these myths. That's understandable. It's a big country. King George was on the other side of the Atlantic and out of touch. Popular culture also makes much of distance. American heroes traverse broad, bleak territory. Abraham Lincoln walked 9 miles to school and 3 miles, or maybe 6, to return a penny. Tom Sawyer floating down the endless Mississippi, Paul Bunyan, etc. By the 1930s, of course, the lived experience of distance had changed. It had shrunk due to technology. But creating and emphasizing distance remained a powerful mode of curating past and present. These bedrock myths of distance thrust up through layers of remembered and disappeared past, and they offer American culture a time-trusted strategy for covering, blunting, or redirecting memories. In the politics of the interwar years, distanciation fueled isolationism. American culture imagined itself distant and protected itself with that distance. This imagined distance allowed American communities to dissociate themselves, leaning into what E.T. Lilienthal calls the comfortable horrible. And my point is that this continues to this day. The Holographic Survivors Initiative on the screen is just the latest example of this. What happens is that guests welcome the illusion of close personal connection through what is a ghost survivor. So the hologram that you see there answers guest questions using pre-recorded answers. And so to make it work, guests have to ask and hit particular keywords in their questions. And those questions and those keywords focus on this comfortable horrible. These two strategies of remembering, over-remembering distance and reducing experience to a controlled, comfortable, horrible memory, still dominate in American culture. And they are reinforced by other motifs and tropes. The good war, World War II was the good war, and a collective ethical certitude. I'm not going to expand on those here, but my point is that the accumulated weight of this, of over-distanciated identity and comfortably horrible narratives of the 19th century, they became embedded in subterranean strata of American cultural memory. They informed Americans' inaction in the 30s and 40s, sanitized subsequent narratives of that inaction, and I suspect that also inhibits genocide prevention today. Because today, in the American memory landscape, there is still a love of comfortably horrible memoirs, films, and exhibitions. Ideologies of the Holocaust are remembered as the opposite of American values and national narratives. In a 2013 article, Carl T. Muth noted that even scholarly narratives of World War II often invoke distance to divorce the racism of the American home front from the Holocaust. What's more problematic in terms of education and prevention, Kuth suggests, is that a growing library of video games perpetuate this disjointed remembering. For example, players can choose their avatar's skin tone and equipment, which completely negates the historical truth. More importantly, Kuth notes, this is a quote, "In every one of these games, the central activity, whether the player chooses American, German, or British roles, is to drive around the French countryside in mixed mechanized infantry units which was historically a small portion of the war, and many of the themes revolve around liberating concentration and work camps, which was in reality only a secondary or tertiary objective. In other words, genocide becomes a backdrop against which gamers play hero. The immersive contexts appear historical, just like the hologram. One effect of this is that a catastrophic history of looking the other way is lightened of historical burden. Of course, ethnocentric memories of World War II are not unique to the United States, but American memory culture is particularly self-affirming. And you can maybe make out the graph there from the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that demonstrates Americans are more likely than all but one of their major allies to claim national responsibility for victory, and at the same time, considerably less likely to look in the mirror when asked about responsibility or causation. By over-imagining distance and encouraging these comfortable, horrible narratives, American memory culture reinforces a very subtle form of denial. We didn't know until our boys got over there. And you see this again and again. As Appiah said, American memory culture keeps tracing the same contours with different pens. This is not an inevitable response to genocide. In the US, however, leaning into these well-worn contours remains a key component of national memory culture. What I'm pretty excited about is the US Holocaust Memorial Museum trying to counter this narrative and narrow the distance, or the imagined distance, between faraway genocide and local history. They've developed a citizen research initiative called History Unfolded. History Unfolded crowdsources primary source research to document how local newspapers across the United States covered both Nazi-occupied Europe and related events in the US. The museum curators identified 41 events. Many of them you would recognize as precursors to the genocide in Europe. But those events also include those listed on the PowerPoint, domestic events within US history. For each event, the museum provides a short essay of historical context. They provide keywords and timeframes. Participants choose the newspapers and scour the dates for articles. They submit a metadata form and a screenshot of the article and the newspaper. The work is reviewed for clarity and accuracy, and each participant gets personalized feedback. To date, the museum has collected more than 31,000 submissions. Those are just the ones that have been accepted. In the museum and online, you can see this in the image in the upper right, researchers can search by keyword, subject, date, and simply by clicking on a touchscreen map. I've used History Unfolded in a variety of non-US history courses for undergraduate BA students. More than 200 of my students have submitted articles and analyzed how journalists' decisions shape public understanding. Students would rather write about Kristallnacht than the way the Waukesha Freemen explained Kristallnacht. And many of their analyses show this kind of disturbance. So for example, a student this semester named Megan found an article in the Brooklyn Eagle on the Porters Union March. And she wrote, this is her analysis, the coverage is sort of one-sided and does not go into any of the inequality that the Black population regularly faced. It is just trying to get the colored population to support the white mayor. The headline is big, but the article is next to a photo of Mayor LaGuardia from a different article. I see this more as a political stunt to help the mayor and Roosevelt stay in office. I think I have another example. Another student was surprised to find advertisements, which you see in the newspaper page shot there, framing an article about the sinking of a refugee ship. This was an article in the Oakland Tribune from Oakland, California. Samantha noted, page 2, and this is the page you're seeing, was dedicated completely to the war effort, with the exception of advertisements at the bottom side of the page. A large photo draws attention to the story about the ship sinking because of the melancholy look on the children's faces. Oh wait, this is not the one you're seeing. I apologize. You're seeing a different one. The rest of the page has various war-related articles. The ads at the bottom of the page seem like they are meant to keep residents focused on fashion, material possessions, and vacation. This is what you're seeing now. Anna submitted an article from the Collinsville News in Collinsville, Oklahoma. And that's where you see the headline, "Weakening and Ruin of Subject People is Nazi Objective." Anna wrote, "The first thing noticeable about the publication of this information was that it was hidden in the newspaper. The article is on page 6 of the paper with at least 6 other articles and 8 images, none of which relate to Lemkin and his word genocide. The newspaper cared more about farming and town news, which was on the front page, than this new war-related word. By placing the article towards the end of the paper among advertisements and intriguing images of bird cages, the editors felt this information wasn't all that important." I could go on and on. This is really exciting to me, how the students are seeing for themselves this forgotten history. But I think in the interest of time, I'll keep going. What History Unfolded does is push through well-worn contours of American memory culture. It pushes through furrowed narratives of distant despots and individual heroism through bite-sized research. History Unfolded also raises questions about American Holocaust memorials. And I think I can skip that as well because Olof spoke to this a little bit, talking about the museum, these granite and glass structures that skirt human actors. History Unfolded challenges today's prevailing comfortable myth that we, Americans, didn't know, that Allied troops, our boys, discovered the Holocaust in 1944, maybe in 1945. It forces students to reimagine what they think we know and know. It suggests to students and researchers that bystanders to the Holocaust included not only European neighbors, but also millions of American newspaper subscribers who witnessed the Holocaust through their hometown papers. This is the value of the History Unfolded project. It demonstrates concretely how much American men and women, the ordinary citizens of the United States, did know about events in far-off Nazi-occupied Europe. And it reveals the way even well-intended commemorations over-exonerate us. And I think this is the crucial step in genocide prevention. Disrupting a dominant, comfortably horrible memory culture that has been hardened by 300 years of voyeurism. In short, American memory culture uses public narratives of the Holocaust self-referentially to deepen channels in a culture of self-referential exceptionalism. And I say that as an American citizen. Recontouring memory culture by challenging these contours is a risky proposition, especially in Washington, D.C., where dozens of museums clamor for public and private funding. Nowhere else is American memory culture so fraught. What is unique about History Unfolded, I believe, is that the project challenges the contours of memory culture in ways that survivor narratives and expert analyses have not. It may or may not disrupt academic historiography, but by using local journalism to globalize the public definition of bystander, History Unfolded disrupts a persistent theme in American memory culture. This is critical to challenging contemporary complacent voyeurism and recentering the goal of genocide prevention and genocide studies. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And we will move now to the fourth presentation in this panel by Jana Sayantani, Mass Violence and Silenced Memory, a comparative study of the November pogrom of 1938 in Berlin and the Great Calcutta killings in 1946. Jana Sayantani is a fourth-year PhD candidate in the history department. Hello, Jana. Nice seeing you. At the University of Southern California. Her research fields span modern Europe and modern South Asia, with specialization in Holocaust and genocide studies. She is training as a comparative genocide studies scholar, with particular research interests in German and German Jewish history, history of the Holocaust, history of the partition in South Asia, histories of empire and decolonization, gender and violence, memory and trauma studies. The floor is yours now.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to the organizers of this conference. I would like to begin my paper by just saying that this is a very, very early draft of a project, my dissertation project. So having said that, I'll begin. I'd like to begin with a quote by Michael Rothberg from his book, Multidirectional Memory. In it, he writes, "The rise of Holocaust memory emerged in dialogue with the dynamic transformations and multifaceted struggles that defined the era of decolonization. The period between 1945 and 1962 contains both the rise of consciousness of the Holocaust as an unprecedented form of modern genocide and the coming to national consciousness and political independence of many of the subjects of European colonialism." So in this paper, I try to bring together these two of these different kinds of consciousnesses that Michael Rothberg has identified as central to the 20th century. By juxtaposing two events of mass violence, one situated within the context of the Holocaust and the other within that of the Indian partition, I try to understand how each society responded to their violent pasts, similarities and differences in their cultures of remembrance, and observations drawn from such comparisons that can perhaps aid our understanding of the silences that continue to exist. So the events in question that I look at are the Kristallnacht of 1938 in Germany, particularly in Berlin in the case of my paper, and the Great Killings of August 1946 in Calcutta, India. While the former is also known as the November Pogrom, orchestrated by the Nazi administration between 9th and 10th November 1938 against the Jewish population across Germany, the latter has often been termed as the Great Calcutta Riots or the Bengal Riots of 1946, and occupies a middle ground between a pogrom and a riot. Now, the Kristallnacht, as is known today, was carried out primarily by the SA, the SS, and the Hitler Youth, with significant civilian participation as well. The event resulted in massive destruction of Jewish property, sexual abuse of Jewish women and girls, which comes from recent research on the event, and the death of several hundreds of Jewish persons. In its aftermath, a fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks was imposed on the Jewish population by the Nazi government, and some 30,000 German Jewish men arrested and sent to concentration camps. Now, scholars have seen the Kristallnacht as a turning point in Nazi persecution of the Jewish population in Germany. And this is not only because this was an event that expedited Jewish emigration and therefore enabled further expropriation of the community, but also because the Kristallnacht was a litmus test of sorts to assess sentiments amongst the non-Jewish German public. In the absence of significant protests to the violence that transpired during the Kristallnacht, the Nazis were emboldened to pursue further drastic anti-Semitic measures. Retrospectively, scholars have recognized the Kristallnacht as exhibiting early signs of the genocide that was to follow. The Great Calcutta Killings lasted from 16 to 20th August 1946 and had begun as a series of coordinated attacks by Muslim League groups against Hindu homes, shops, and places of worship with the tacit approval of the Muslim League provincial government in Bengal. It subsequently escalated into a riot with organized retaliation from Hindu factions under the Hindu Mahasabha and the Bengal Congress. The violence resulted in 5,000 deaths and some 10,000 injured persons. In fact, the event is considered today by partition scholars as a turning point in Hindu-Muslim relations in pre-partition British India, following which successive, almost consecutive outbreaks of Hindu-Muslim violence would break out across eastern, northern, and northwestern India for the next 12 months. It is significant to note that the Great Calcutta Killings became a symbolic memory that was repeatedly evoked by both Hindus and Muslims, to lend a narrative of retribution to the violence that was carried out across East Bengal, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, and even the Punjab in its aftermath. Even today, the memory of this event in Calcutta remains mired in identitarian politics across the Bengal border, projected as a spontaneous outburst of violence in Muslim narratives and as defensive violence in Hindu ones. So besides the turning point that is represented by these aforementioned two events in their respective histories, the cities of Berlin and Calcutta were also important metropolises of their time. In 1938, Berlin was not only the site of the Nazi government, but it was also the city with the largest Jewish population in Germany. Meanwhile, in 1946, Calcutta was the second largest city in the Commonwealth of the British Empire, in addition to being the capital of the province of Bengal. It had also been the capital of British India until 1911 and had a notorious reputation for being a hotbed of the anti-colonial movement. Now, despite the expansive corpus of literature on both the Holocaust and the partition, and even, in fact, on the Kristallnacht itself, the histories of the November pogrom in Berlin and the Great Killings in Calcutta remain significantly underexplored. Yet Berlin was one of the two cities most affected by the Kristallnacht, the other being Vienna. In Calcutta, meanwhile, the unprecedented magnitude of the violence had earned it the description of civil war, both by witnesses and retrospectively by historians, a term that has also on occasions been used to describe the entirety of the partition violence. So what explains this relative silence around the memory of these events in these particular cities? Studies of the commemorative cultures that developed in both Germany and India in the aftermath of these respective events suggest certain similarities. It can be said that the Holocaust and the Indian partition represented the outcomes of two different kinds of ethno-nationalism, violent ethno-nationalism, on rise during the 20th century. In Germany, racialist rhetoric was used to genocidal ends in the pursuit for a regenerated Aryan national community, whereas in India, violence became a mechanism to define the future national community in anticipation of the withdrawal of empire. In the aftermath of the Second World War and the Indian partition, respectively, both Germany and India would also exhibit significant resistance in accepting responsibility for the violence that had transpired. So in Germany, a narrative of German victimization quickly came to be adopted in the aftermath of the war, which emphasized the loss and suffering that had been brought on by the war. In India, the influx of Hindu and Sikh refugees across the eastern and particularly the western borderlands allowed public discourse to downplay the role of Hindu and Sikh elites in partition violence, laying the blame for the territorial divide and the violence squarely on the shoulders of the Muslim League. With the ongoing conflict in Kashmir in 1948 and 1949, in early Indian national historiography would also waver in the degree of responsibility that it accorded to the British. Now, apart from the narratives of victimization adopted by both Germany and India, another similarity is the tendency amongst early historians in both countries, in regard to their respective histories of violence, to treat the Holocaust and the partition as historical intrusions or aberrations, So in Germany, we have the now contested Sonderweg debate, in which historians try to explain Germany's descent into fascism in terms of the deviant path that it took from other Western nations in charting its eventual course to democracy. Likewise, in early partition historiography, historians try to account for the catastrophic violence of the territorial divide as, and I quote the historian Jana here, a dramatic and ephemeral deviation from the natural movement towards majority independent rule in a united subcontinent. So how is this significant to understanding the silence around the memories of the Kristallnacht in Berlin or the Great Killings in Calcutta? I try to present some preliminary observations here, but of course my project is in its very early stages, so I don't provide any conclusive answers. The Kristallnacht in Germany represented the last major event of anti-Jewish violence prior to the outbreak of war that transpired in the presence of, and in many cases with participation from, the German public. Even as the knowledge of genocide itself, having transpired primarily in the eastern occupied regions, was easy to deny after the war, the same could not be said of the Kristallnacht. In fact, as historian Mary Fulbrook has noted, the Kristallnacht represented the moment in which the transformation of German society into a bystander society became complete, whether people chose to partake in the violence, look away from the violence, or even just to accord entire responsibility to the Nazi government. This then already rendered the Kristallnacht as a memory situated not just in opposition to the war, to the post-war narrative of German victimization, but also in contrast to the very understanding of the Holocaust as an unprecedented or aberrant event of violence. In the case of the partition, that continues to be a living memory influencing geopolitics in South Asia even today, a central matter of debate has been the question of culpability, where each community continues to blame the other, and in doing so denies its own guilt. It is possible to contend that perhaps one reason for the silence that continues to exist around the memory of the great killings in Calcutta is because of its position as the turning point, or the beginning in organized partition violence. The question of responsibility in the case of the Great Calcutta Killings thus holds significant political implications for the very discourse around the violence of the partition itself. Further, existing research on the Great Calcutta Killings has also revealed clear intentions on the sides of both Hindu and Muslim elites in fomenting violence to their own political ends. Thus, in contrast to the partition as an aberration, the outbreak of violence in Calcutta shows some of the earliest political machinations where violence was as much a mechanism to attain partition as it was a repercussion of it. Further, the case of Berlin and Calcutta also provide interesting points of comparison when one considers the ways in which these cities experienced the aftermath of the Second World War and the partition, respectively. In negotiations over the borders in Bengal, Calcutta had remained a point of contention. With its majority Hindu population, the Indian National Congress had insisted on its inclusion within the borders of India, and yet the city was also the site of the Muslim League provincial government. After the partition, the memory of the territorial divide would manifest viscerally on the urban landscape in the form of the continuous influx of refugees from East Bengal between 1947 and 1971. As one partition witness and scholar from Calcutta explained during her interview, and here I quote her, the case of Western India was very different from Eastern India. There, everything happened in one fell swoop. That did not happen here. In Bengal, the partition was experienced as a longer, more drawn-out process than in the Punjab. While the result of the one fell swoop in the case of the latter was violence of genocidal proportions in 1947, the former experienced partition as an ongoing crisis. This was facilitated not just by the Hindu-Muslim violence experienced in 1946 and 1947, but also in the ongoing unrest in East Pakistan that would ultimately spill over into war and genocide and the eventual liberation of Bangladesh. In Calcutta in 1971, as another partition survivor recalls, the site of the Bangladeshi Liberation Army training with Indian soldiers was a common one, as was the site of bomber jets flying by overhead. The experience, as it were, appears to have been very similar to being on the front line in an ongoing war. In Berlin, too, one finds the sense of an ongoing crisis present even after the end of the Second World War. By the end of the war, the urban landscape had been severely damaged by bombing and would go on to suffer even more demolitions and reconstructions as the Allies tried to redraw the political map of the city. By 1961, the establishment of the wall was a visceral reminder of Berlin as the literal frontline of the Cold War. As the urban historian Brian Ladd has noted, the wall also engendered a language of dualism in regard to the German national character. So on the one hand, people on either side of the wall attributed the old prejudiced authoritarian ways to people on the other side of the wall. And yet on the other hand, there was this unanimous agreement in both Germanys of East Germany as a repository of old German traditions and values untouched by foreign influences. So the wall thus simultaneously encouraged an active denial of German guilt, as well as a collective acceptance of Germany's, and especially Berlin's, role as Cold War victim. The silence around the Kristallnacht, particularly in Berlin, could then perhaps be ascribed to a significant degree to the existence of these complementary public discourses, in addition to the general willingness to forget that shown by the state on both sides of the wall. Thus, while in West Germany, the Adenauer government would try to reintegrate former Nazis back into German society, the GDR in East Germany deliberately replaced the memory of the Kristallnacht with that of the November 9th revolution in 1918. It was only in the 1960s, and more prominently after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, that German society would move towards a fuller confrontation with its violent past. Perhaps some of the silence around the Kristallnacht in Berlin, then, that continues to exist today, can be attributed to the receding of the memory of this event from the public sphere, overburdened as it has been with the competing and overwhelming memories of the Second World War, the Holocaust, and the literal division of the city during the Cold War itself. The situation in India remains quite the opposite. Again, to quote the historian Gyanendra Pandey, who writes, "If it is the question of guilt and the necessity of the remembrance of suffering that has animated the German debate on the historiography of the Holocaust, it is a question of India's unity and the need to forget in the interests of that unity that Indians are asked to take and have taken as guide in their historical scholarship. It is possible, however, to point out shortcomings in both of these commemorative cultures. In Germany, the institutionalization of Holocaust memory has been rendered possible by establishing a distance between the past and the present, as something that happened there, not here. Conversely, in India, the inability for historians and the public to distance themselves from this past has made the partition a living memory that must continuously be forgotten in order to move forward. Both approaches run the risk of allowing the societies in question the complacency to forget, or even to ensure the intentional silencing of the memory of the events. Thus, comparative studies can perhaps offer us a moment of reflection for each society in identifying ways to recuperate such memories and address the inadequacies that exist in our methods of remembering, and in so doing, allow us to find ways to mend them. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you. We have listened now to four extremely interesting presentations, so diverse, but all touching on the Holocaust from global comparative points of view, and dealing with the comparative genocide perspectives, and referring to the practical and ethical aspects of memory, so to say, the here and now of the history. We will now invite our commentator, Ferenc Lacho. Hello.
Hello.
It's good to have you here. I will shortly introduce you. Ferenc Lacho is a historian and his assistant professor with tenure at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Maastricht University. He is author of several books, including Hungarian Jews in the Age of Genocide and Intellectual History, 1929-1948. And co-editor most recently with Luka Lisiak, Gabrielcic, the legacy of division East and West after 1989, and also co-editor with Włodzimierz Borodziej and Joachim von Puttkamer of the Routledge History Handbook of Central and Eastern Europe in the 20th Century, Volume 3, Intellectual Horizons. His writings have appeared in 10 languages and have been reviewed in more than 30 publications. So now we invite you to give your commentaries to all the presentations that we have heard.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon from me as well. Can you all hear me fine? I hope it's working, so I'll get started.
Yes, we can hear.
So it is a great privilege for me to have the chance to comment on these papers. Thank you so much for all these intriguing presentations. I wish to address each paper in turn before I would offer some more general thoughts on the panel as a whole. So Sławomir Kapralski's overview titled Roma Memories of the Holocaust accounts for why Roma memories of mass violence during World War II have at first remained rather fragmented and could only exert limited impact. Kapralski is right to emphasize that traumatization, lack of means, and the general disinterest of, not to mention discrimination by, other members of society have all contributed to this. I find the author's reflections on how re-traditionalization attempts in the post-war period might be viewed as a response to the destruction of social boundaries under the Nazi regime particularly illuminating. The second half of Kapralski's article, in turn, focuses on the shift from non-discursive to discursive forms of remembrance among German Sinti in particular, and it argues that a top-down genealogy of memory has developed even while bottom-up genealogies have remained. Rather, the newly powerful narratives of the Holocaust, which help Roma and Sinti activists claim the power to represent themselves, may exemplify this broader shift. Kapralski also adds a more theoretical perspective to argue that the past, if mobilized in the right kind of way, may qualify as an area where the politics of identity and the fight for redistribution and human rights could successfully merge. This amounts to him suggesting that the category of memory may help synthesize Roma politics of identity and policies of redistribution. The paper's arguments regarding early absences, later shifts, and current potential led me to wonder about the following three questions in particular. First, how about the role of interactions with other victim groups' memories, most obviously those of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust? How have Roma and Sinti strategies of remembrance been impacted by such multidirectional processes between members of various groups? Second, and to my mind equally importantly, could one perhaps argue that the emerging politics of identity studied in this paper in such a nuanced manner is as much the result of acts of adopting a new and powerful template focused on claims to victimhood as the product of remembering the specific past experiences of one's ancestors in detail and depth? This appears to me a moot question regarding the actual role of memory, and thus a question with wider implications. Third, I was also wondering how the narrative told regarding the Sinti from Germany, whom the article clearly focuses on at certain points, would perhaps need to be modified if the European dimension was explored more comprehensively. Are similar processes underway in other countries with large Romani communities, especially in Central and Eastern Europe? And if so, how might their consequences differ in societies which do not place comparable emphases on Nazi crimes as contemporary Germany does? Let me address Olof Bortz's paper and presentation on Raul Hilberg next. A presentation which deals primarily with the relation between Hilberg's scholarly work and him as an actor in shaping, or perhaps I should say rather attempting to shape Holocaust remembrance. I would like to underline straight away that Hilberg's self-presentation as a lonely pioneer has been somewhat exaggerated. Hilberg was in fact personally acquainted with some of the major researchers of the early post-war years, such as Philip Friedman. Moreover, as Elisabeth Gallas has shown, Hilberg largely derived his approach from his mentor Franz Neumann, while filling notable gaps in Neumann's scholarship. Born in 1926, Hilberg was also old enough to have witnessed as a young adult that first major wave of Holocaust-related publications that started practically as soon as the war had ended. This is to imply that Hilberg's successful self-presentation as the pioneering professional researcher of the destruction of European Jews had more to do with the widespread recognition and acceptance of his specific way of doing archive-based research on official documents than with the actual publication date of his major work some 16 years after 1945. I don't think I need to elaborate here that the publication of Hilberg's major monograph coincided with great interest in the Nazi bureaucratic machinery of destruction and the role of so-called desk killers, interests that may sound somewhat dated to us today. One of the things that has struck me in Bortz's presentation is that Hilberg approached the tasks associated with representing and commemorating the Holocaust primarily as a scholar and wished to see his interpretative framework reflected in the emerging USHMM's choices as well. While some of his aesthetic recommendations are indeed reflected in the physical shape the Memorial Museum took, Hilberg's other preferences have only been partially met. And here we may perceive one of the great ironies of Hilberg's career, namely that his growing recognition as the leading scholarly expert of a major recent historical subject in the 1970s and 1980s went hand in hand with the reconceptualization of that very same subject in ways that in many ways went contrary to his own approach. By the 1980s, we can observe a cultural shift towards engaging with survivors and their witness testimonies and towards much more empathic respect towards their preferences and wishes. These broad shifts made several of Hilberg's key choices, such as him deriving his explanations from within Nazi self-understanding and his insistence on Jews having been largely passive victims, appear rather problematic. What I aim to suggest by elaborating on this is that the story Bortz tells in his paper may be seen as rather ironic. After all, the Holocaust entered the US's cultural mainstream by the 1980s and 90s through the rise of new preoccupations that canonized Hilberg as a pioneering researcher, but also made him appear as somebody who was no longer quite attuned to current trends. More generally, the paper raises broader questions regarding how scholars might be able to impact forms of popular remembrance, and whether the detached and analytical mode of scholarship is not per se different from the more emotional tenor of so much of popular culture. The USHMM is, of course, an excellent avenue to explore this issue, since this institution intends to combine scholarly and commemorative functions. What might be the exact role of scholarly approaches in future forms of remembrance is a question I consider to be of great relevance to all of us, and one that we might wish to address more directly in our discussions. Kimberly Redding's paper, Local Journalists, Distant Genocides and Global Bystanders, offers a timely intervention and also makes several valuable recommendations. Kimberly Redding insists that the key goal of genocide studies ought to be genocide prevention, and that the cause of prevention would be helped by us questioning our traditional ideas of geographical and political borders to broaden our concept of bystanders. The author also offers timely and critical reflections on how Holocaust remembrance in the US is insufficiently critical, as it perpetuates a sense that we Americans knew little about what was going on over there until our heroic soldiers discovered the victims and the emaciated survivors at the time of liberation. This rather comfortable narrative in turn allows for distant voyeurism when it comes to the greatest crime Europe has seen in the 20th century, she asserts. Kimberly Redding also shows how the History Unfolded project of the USHMM provides a much needed alternative to this prevalent narrative and to this problematic approach. These arguments are intriguing and have given me much food for thought. I would like to focus here on a number of points where I believe the paper might still be in need of some further clarifications. My first question would concern the following. How to broaden the category of bystander without flattening it? In a related manner, I would want to ask what being defined as a bystander might have to do with having the power to do something about what is happening. Or to put it more concretely, would people in, say, Congo or Mongolia qualify as global bystanders to genocide in the middle of Europe the way US or British citizens or the Germans themselves may have been? And if not, why not? And what does that tell us about the way we can and should measure proximity to and distance from certain events when we reflect on questions of responsibility? Related to that is the question whether local newspapers can actually be expected to train citizens with global consciousness or in global consciousness when their main ambition is to report on local affairs. At the same time, I was wondering, might references to events in our own lifetime not perhaps serve better the purpose of demonstrating to people that they have been global bystanders? Last but certainly not least, I find the current debate in the US about what the ambition to police the world has brought both profoundly interesting and of truly great relevance. If the US has a responsibility to protect across the globe, would that not perhaps imply that it would also have to permanently invest in its military to assure its continued global supremacy? Now, considered in this light, would we have to then say that the cause of genocide prevention and that of pacifism might be at odds with each other? And I think this conundrum requires some further reflection. These are again some of the main questions that this really thoughtful, critical, and very timely piece made me wonder about. Sayantani Jana's Mass Violence and Silenced Memory looks at the Holocaust and the partition of British India, two cases, even if rather different ones, of religiously and or ethnically based violent separations. I consider such global comparisons essential, and I'm convinced that the need for them will only grow in the coming years. Having said that, the author also zooms in on the cities of Berlin and Kolkata to elaborate the comparison between the function and consequences of patterns of remembrance and silencing, without really specifying who the key memory agents she wishes to study are and what exactly is being analytically compared here. I would also like to insist that the article looks at two rather different kinds of relations: interethnic or interreligious violence, with violence being committed on both sides, as during the partition, this is the one case, versus the catastrophe before the catastrophe, known as the November pogroms of 1938, preceding mass extermination by members of one group against another in the other case. To my mind, this is a major difference that would require some further elaboration when aiming to perform a direct comparison. On a related note, I was wondering what the inclusion of cases of newly emerging states, such as the state of Israel or Pakistan, and especially East Pakistan, might add to the analysis. It seems to me that if Germany and India, and also Berlin and Kolkata, are eminently comparable, so should be Israel and Pakistan and their respective relations to the other side as well. An intriguing perspective that the author's comparative reflections have opened concerns the function of remembrance. What emerges from her reflections is that not actively remembering can mean being unable not to reproduce certain patterns, see the case of India, while consciously recalling atrocities of the past might enable societies to move on, as the case of Germany in more recent years suggests. This would indeed be an intriguing correlation, which implies that the purpose of conscious remembrance is not so much to recall the past, but to put a distance between the past and the present. To conclude, the 4 papers I have just tried to comment on address the spread of a sense of historical victimhood among members, what is still often a discriminated group, address a leading scholar as a moderately successful agent in shaping remembrance, discuss the possibilities to extend our understanding of bystanders in order to bolster prevention, and discuss the role of remembering and silencing in a comparative manner when dealing with the past. Beyond their thematic diversity and various valuable arguments, what appears to connect all these papers is their shared interest in the effects of remembering victimhood, and also their probing exploration of how different scholarly approaches and strategies, whether analytical detachment, innovative comparisons, or conceptual innovations, might help us redefine our aims as scholars and also as citizens. I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much for this thoroughly prepared commentary, really. I will just mention now that there is around over 60 people attending this conference at the moment. We realize the inconvenience with asking questions through the emails or the Q&A panels, but this is the time if you want to add your questions to the discussion. This would be the best time now to do it. And now I would like to ask our 4 presenters to try to address the commentaries by Ferenc Lacho. Okay, who wants to speak first? Maybe as we started, maybe Sławek Kapralski first.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much. I want to thank the reviewer for this very detailed and sympathetic reading of my paper. I want to say that that I've sent a larger version of about 12 pages, which I only summarize in my presentation today due to the time restrictions. Coming to the questions, the question number 1 is about the interaction of the Roma victims with other categories of victims, and most notably with the Jewish victims. Of course, this was a very important issue, although slightly difficult. From the very beginning, there was a cooperation between Jewish and Roma victims, and Jewish organizations of survivors offered an enormous assistance to the Roma survivors who were not represented in Germany. So on this very, let's say, grassroots level of this was a network of interactions. However, on the level of, let's say, a more general conceptualization of identity of the victims, there were often conflicts. Conflicts which were related to the fact that for many Roma, the Jews were perceived as, those who monopolized suffering. And the general narrative of the Holocaust was developed in such a way that, well, the Holocaust was a Jewish thing, something what happened to Jews only, and the uniqueness of Jewish suffering was permanently emphasized, what of course created many negative reactions on the side of the Roma. And when the group of the Roma intellectuals were developed in 1960s and 1970s, they often criticized this stream in the general reflections of the Holocaust and some commemorative practices, like, for example, the lack of the proper representation of the Roma suffering in the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, the lack of Roma representatives in the council. There is some sort of the fundamental break also on the so-called, well, Jewish side, which can be rated by two eminent figures, Elie Wiesel and Simon Wiesenthal, with Elie Wiesel permanently rejecting the claims of Roma to be somehow involved in the narrative of the Holocaust, and Simon Wiesenthal, who offered enormous assistance to the Roma intellectuals and activists who claimed that they were the victims too. In the present, what is especially important is the so-called globalized discourse of the Holocaust, which, and here I'm coming to the answer to the second question, which is also responsible for this claim to victimhood as part of the politics of identity. Yes, this phenomenon exists. We can see it, for example, if we take a look into those Roma communities which didn't suffer during the Second World War. I mean, for example, Spanish, Gitanos, Spanish Roma communities, they were not affected. Okay, they had their own problems with General Franco and the local regime, but they were not persecuted by the Nazis, and they didn't survive. They didn't suffer genocide. However, recently I can see a huge interest in the history of the persecution of Roma during the Second World War. On the side of the Spanish Roma, they are coming to the meetings. They visit the memorial sites. Young people from Spain, young Gitanos, are participating in various educational activities. And I often have an impression that this is something what Landsberg has called prosthetic memory, where we adopt a certain vision of the past, which is not exactly ours, but it is the vision of the people to whom we believe we belong. And this may indicate that there is a growing, let's say, pan-Roma European movement, and the Spanish Roma, who were always somehow on the margins of the mainstream of Roma initiatives, now want to belong, and therefore they adopt the same approach to history as those who were directly affected. And finally, the third question, are there similar processes in other countries? Well, to some extent, yes, but of course, the main difference is that in Germany, the local Sinti and Roma communities are facing the country which is somehow taking the responsibility for what happened. In other countries of East Central Europe, especially, Roma organizations are facing the institutions or state agendas which don't take responsibility, even if they were to some extent responsible for the persecution. I'm speaking here of the collaborating regimes. There is some sort of retraditionalization that I could see, for example, in Poland, but in many countries, especially in former communist countries, this process was somehow stopped because of the forcible assimilation that happened in 1950s and 1960s. Something what didn't happen to the Roma in Western Europe. Therefore, in Eastern Europe, it is very difficult to see the continuity of memories because something new happened. This forcible sedentarization, assimilation in 1950s, 1960s was the event that somehow covered the previous memories. So that would be my answer to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And now it's turn for Olof Bortz.
Yes, hello. I also would like to thank you very much for your thorough reading and insightful comments. I did have some trouble getting everything, but from what I heard was very well taken comments, and I will try to respond to them just briefly. Concerning sort of Hilberg's self-dramatization as this sort of lonely night of Holocaust research, I didn't really take the opportunities to sort of question that sort of narrative. And yeah, I think I already tried to squeeze in a bit too much within this paper. But of course, you're right in pointing out that Hilberg was not, in fact, completely alone. I sort of tried to mention this more sort of as a self-perception, and this sort of it. If you analyze it critically, it doesn't have to be an argument for the so-called Holocaust silence and so on. But yeah, this was more sort of a way of illustrating Hilberg's journey and the advent of large-scale Holocaust memory in more political and cultural terms in the late 1970s and beyond. And also, I agree with you, as I try to point out sort of the limitations of Hilberg's efforts to shape the memory of the Holocaust, and perhaps one could say that he was mostly successful in sort of stressing the research and the educational part of the USHMM. But I just conclude by saying that I think that this irony you mentioned is very well put, and I think that sort of Hilberg's reaching this sort of apogee of his career in the 1980s or late 1970s was also the beginning of his decline in some way. So yeah, but I have more things to say, but I will allow my co-panelists to respond also to your comments. I will contact you for further discussion. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much to you too. And now please, Kimberly Redding.
Hello again. Thank you so much for the comments and the thoughts and the incentive to think further. You've actually addressed some of the questions that I've been grappling with. I want to start with maybe the easy question. You asked about the role of local papers and is it their job to convey international events. That may be my mischaracterization in saying local papers. This category includes for the project everything from the New York Times to the Waukesha Freeman to the LA Times and the statewide Jewish Chronicle. And the other thing I would say was that all of these papers in the day, in that time, most of them anyway, subscribed to international, the international wire services, the AP wire services, and they tended to be, in the small towns in particular, the major source of news other than the movies. So I think we could look at this paper by paper, and that's not the point of this conversation, but I think it's worth thinking about and clarifying for myself which papers I'm talking about. The two questions that are really most interesting to me, I'll address together. So one was, is there a risk of flattening the notion of bystander? And does power and agency matter? And I would say yes, and yes. Yes, there's a risk of flattening, and yes, power matters. And I think maybe what I'm grasping towards with this term global bystanders is some kind of differentiation that I don't know exists as a response to asserting distance and, I guess, naivete. I think it's very problematic to claim agency in the sense of we won the war, but not claim agency in terms of what was not done. And this is a big question in American history, which I don't really do. There are other examples of this, most notably the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which have also been greatly contested. So I think yes and yes, and I would love further conversation about how to kind of differentiate, I think, between bystanders with and without power. And I think as long as we assert democracy, then some of that power does come down to individuals and an informed, hopefully, public. The other question I'll address, I don't remember the exact wording, but there was a question about, might it be more useful in thinking about genocide prevention, might it be more useful to focus on more recent genocides? In my experience as an educator, and I guess a public speaker, I'm not sure. There's a real discomfort, at least in the context in which I teach and speak to communities. There's a real discomfort engaging political events within the last, I would say, generation. And there's a real suspicion of the political agendas and how those narratives are told. So on the other hand, stories about the Holocaust or explanations of different parts of the Holocaust have a ready audience. So maybe this is the distance thing again, but I don't think it's one or the other. And I've been grappling with a way to kind of crack open the Holocaust focus in this country on movies and Anne Frank and related memoirs and turn the mirror back on ourselves. And I think I'll stop there. And thank you for your comments, and thank everyone else for their papers too. I've got pages of notes here that I hope I can decipher later today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And Jana, Sayantani, your turn to address the questions.
Yes. Like everybody else stated, thank you so much for the close reading of the paper and for those comments. I think especially for me as a graduate student in the early stages of my project, it's really helpful to have this feedback, and some of those questions get at some of the things that I've been trying to grapple with as well in my project. I'll address the three main questions I think that came out of the discussion. So in terms of who are the key memory agents, I see the key memory agents as being the state, of course, in the way that the state obviously either uses or manipulates these narratives of violence. There is on local political levels and of course at the central political level as well. Then there are the academics, obviously, and I speak a little bit about nationalist historiographies and how they have, at least initially, tried to look at these events as historical aberrations and then moved, in the case of Germany more than India really, moved towards a confrontation, a fuller confrontation with the past. Then of course there are the survivors, which I have dealt with less in this paper because I was trying to get more at the silencing of the memories or the problems of how and this will get at my answer to the second question as well, in looking at Berlin and Calcutta, also looking at partitions as a way of fracturing such memories further. And then we have obviously the general public, and by this I mean there are like second, third generations of families of survivors. There are also people who did not directly experience the violence. So in the case of Germany, this would be the non-Jewish German public. In the case of India, there are many parts of India that did not directly experience the violence. So that is what I'm thinking of in terms of key memory agents. The second question, which was what is being analytically compared, as I mentioned, this is part of a bigger project. So I'm looking specifically at the November pogrom in Berlin and the Great Calcutta killings in Calcutta to understand not just memory of these, the discussion around memory of these events, but also to look at things like, for example, the discourse around riots and pogroms, because in South Asia particularly, the terminology of riot is used very loosely, and it comes actually from colonialist discourse, when in fact, when we look at the history of the partition riots are actually can be categorized as a series of pogroms. Wherever there was a majority Muslim population, there was organized attacks against Hindus or Sikhs. Wherever there was a majority Hindu or Sikh population, there were organized attacks against Muslims. So it was not, even though it is categorized as a riot and retaliatory violence, when we zoom in more, and this is kind of the objective of doing microhistory in my case, is that we look at how each of these events that form the totality of the partition are actually a series of pogroms or pogrom-like violence. In fact, there is no proper categorization, perhaps, the more we look at it. Another thing that I was trying to look at, of course, is the idea of how trauma becomes a common language. So in societies with violent histories, I think that even if the events are different, the violent parts are different, which of course they are, there is a way for these memories, these traumatic memories, to form a common language in these societies speaking to each other and sort of trying to understand or look at how each society has addressed its tragic or traumatic past, or what more can be done in terms of facing these pasts. So I think what I'm trying to look at is also how trauma provides this common language for confrontation with such violent pasts and to create a sense of collectivity in these conversations across societies about their histories of violence. And as previously mentioned, one of the things that's interesting to me about Berlin and Calcutta is really Berlin having the wall in 1961, this experience of partition, which in the case of Calcutta, of course, is just the partition of Bengal in general, but also how these cities, the urban landscape, sort of the visual effects of the visual manifestations of the partition affect memory in some way or the other. So I would say those were basically the main analytical comparisons that I was aiming for. And in terms of Pakistan and Israel, I think definitely there is a comparison to be made there. I just feel like I'm not in the best position to make that comparison, but it's an interesting, and I think there are lots of new studies on partition that are coming out, in fact. And I also think the case of Palestine and occupied Kashmir, for example, would be interesting case studies to place side by side and look at. So I think I will stop with that.
Thanks very much. Does any one of you want to add something? Yes, Ferenc? No? Okay. So, since we have no further questions, which I don't think is that bad because we still had, we were able to listen to 6 great presentations, 6 great talks. Thank you to all presenters for that. Thank you for attending here. We will continue the topic of the unspoken and silenced memories on our 4th session titled Overlooking the Local Dimensions of the Holocaust, organized by the Jagiellonian University. So I think that there is an interesting continuity between these two sessions in this sense, and I want to invite you to our tomorrow's session. We will continue tomorrow, same time, with the session titled The Ringelblum Archive as the Earliest Historiography of the Holocaust and its Impact on International Research. And this session will be organized jointly with the Jewish Historical Institute. And the keynote will be held by Professor Omer Bartow. So thanks so much for staying for so long with us. Thanks once again to all the presenters, the commentator. It was really great to see you. I very much hope that one day we can meet in person and not too late. And have a good evening, good afternoon, and see you tomorrow. Thank you.